Welcome this evening to the Blavatnik School. For those of you who are visiting us, it's a real pleasure to have you all to join us this evening. So it's what I'll do is I'll just introduce the speakers and then give our plan for the evening after that. So firstly, it's a real pleasure to have Yuli Tamir with us. She's the president of Shenkar College and formerly the Minister for Education and for Immigration in Israel. And she's a visiting member of faculty here at the Blavatnik School. And Yuli's recently published Why Nationalism, copies of which are on sale outside, and will be talking to us on the main thesis of that book. To my right, your left, is Matt Goodwin, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Kent and a Senior Fellow at Chatham House. And he is also recently published as the co-author of National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. And flyers for that are also available on your exit. I do encourage you to buy the books, they're great. And we're also joined this evening by David Miller, who is a fellow of the British Academy, a former professor of political theory at Nuffield College in Oxford. And the format, Yuli's going to speak to us for approximately 15 minutes initially. Matt will follow on. David will give some brief responses. We may have a little bit of interaction then, and then we're open for Q&A and discussion collectively. And I should say that we are also live streaming this event, so it's anyone in the world could be watching it, which is very exciting. So if you would like not to be quoted or identified as having been present at this very controversial discussion, then keep your hands down. So Brexit, Trump, European populism, all of these involve supranational, the rejection rather of supranational institutions and cosmopolitan ideals. And in their place, each of these movements asserts national sovereignty and the value of particular historically rooted identities. And this has become such a significant part of our political scene that many people talk about the realignment of our politics from a left-right economic disagreement to a globalized national particular axis of disagreement in our politics. So the question we're asking tonight is, what is the future of nationalism? So over to you, Yuli.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Tom, for organizing this event. I should say that, when I sort of started writing this book, for me it was a way to revisit an issue I worked on many years ago during my PhD days here at Oxford, at a time where everybody believed that nationalism was about to be fading away. And people used to convince me that rather than working on nationalism, maybe I'll work on multiculturalism or communitarianism, because, nationalism maybe in the Middle East it's still of some importance. But generally, once I'll finish the dissertation, and suddenly once I'll publish it, nobody will want to read it. And somehow, because personally I think I'm a nationalist, and I feel sort of rather comfortable to say that, as much as I am a social democrat. I felt the issue of nationalism is important, and it's going to appear and reappear in the future because it touches a very essential point that is important to human beings, and it's not going to fade away. So one of the chapters that I really like in the book, it is when you finish a book, some chapters you like, some chapters you regret. This one I like. Sort of reviews the history of nationalism in this century from 1918 to 2018. And I think the clearest thing that comes out of that chapter, titled Never Say Never, is that every 20 years in the passing century, we used to think that dramatic things happen. There's a war to end all war, there is the end of history, There is the end of capitalism. Some people think now it's the end of liberalism. But when you review this century, you understand that what we see is oscillation between different political theories that are there and are part of the modern times, and they are going to be there, but the emphasis shifts from the more maybe liberal, global aspect of political theory to the more national, communal aspect of political theory. And, you know, it would keep, if I have to guess, which is a dangerous thing to do these days, if I have to guess, then I would say this is something that we're going to see even in the future. So the question for me is not why nationalism now, but why are we all being aware of the importance of nationalism now? And maybe why we ignored it, maybe since, you know, Fukuyama has done this enormous impact on the discourse with the end of history. So looking at these years from the end of history to maybe the return of history in a more critical light. And I think the book emphasizes two major issues that I want to follow here and probably then open it to the debate here and then with the audience. First of all, that nationalism tends to be invisible when things go right. It doesn't disappear. It's there. From football teams to Eurovisions, there are moments where people get really excited about their national affiliations. But when a society is stable, when there is prosperity, when nothing seems to be too threatening, then you fall into the Fukuyama trap of thinking that, you know, it's over. But you just have to scratch the surface. You have to be in a situation where a crisis is not even here, it's only on the horizons, that people start to raise questions related to nationalism and are going to be redefining their policies in view of their national affiliations. And we are in that kind of a period. Tom mentioned Trump, Brexit, but now see the elections to the European Parliament, the Danish elections that are happening today. Nationalism is apparent everywhere. And again, those trends were there, they have never disappeared. Even in the most liberal countries in the world, you look at the Nordic countries and you see the emergence of right-wing parties and national discourse. It has been there. Now it reappears because of phenomena that I think is rather new, which is a result of the wave of what Danny Roderick calls hyper-globalization. It's not that globalization is a new thing. It certainly isn't. What is sort of new probably is a question of magnitude, and what Roderick defines as the kind of globalism that tempts individuals to become players in the global arena rather than states. Because the first wave of globalism was globalism where states were working together on a global level. Now, I think we were deluded to think that individuals can do it on their own, that the global competition is free and open for everyone, and therefore what we need mostly is to allow ourselves to participate in this global competition, and maybe what state needs to do is to prepare children to have the skills to compete, but other than that, the people who can do it will do it, and the rest maybe will do less well, but the wealth will trickle down. So we now know trickling down doesn't happen, but not at least in a way that it changes the social structure so people can really enjoy the benefits of globalism. And we also know that the elites, which is a sort of a bad name because it sounds sort of antagonistic to the people who made it, the movers, the people who can move around, the people who can really compete in the global market, their value became enormous. their returns on their investment are enormous, and the social and economic gap, therefore, really accelerated very rapidly. And what we see on one hand is a global elite that moves around, that really takes advantage of all the new opportunities that have been opened for them. And a large group of now, I think all of us relate to it in different ways in our writing, of people who are feeling left behind. And this is the group that now motivates nationalism. Now, we all know that the classical nationalist move was the move of the elite. In the 19th century, nationalism was the project of the elites who recruited the people and created what I call in the book a cross-class coalition in order to create support for their national purposes. But what we see now is that the people who are sort of surfacing with national agenda are people who are asking for greater attention for their needs. And they are the carriers of nationalism now are new. It's not that the phenomena is new, the carriers are new. And the reason why they are involved in this attempt to revive the national discourse is twofold. First of all, they feel, and actually the word feel is not probably the proper description, they have been left behind. They have been sort of confronting a situation that we didn't think would be possible maybe 10, 20 years ago, that the situation is becoming less promising than it was before. You know, we used to think that, you know, children will do better than the parents. Longevity will, you know, keep on accumulating. People will have better lives, will have more to share. The idea of progress was very strong and supported this notion of globalism. But if you look at that group that I call the left behind, and I'm sorry, I should have probably brought only one scheme, and that's the elephant curve, that shows who are the winners and who are the losers of the last waves of nationalism. And you see that the middle classes and lower classes in the developed world have been losing out. And they are the people who are now demanding attention. Their voice was not heard, and I think they are doing something that democratically is quite proper. They are demanding to stop and listen. I tell in the book this little story about Michael Moore walking down the street in California one day, extremely happy and feeling self-satisfied and saying, you know, we've done everything okay, you know, marijuana is free, abortions are legitimized, maybe not so. You know, gay marriages, everything liberalism wanted to achieve has been achieved. And this guy stops him and says, you know, hey, we should vote for Trump. And he says, why? And the guy says, because we have to undo the damage that has been done. And for Michael Moore, for a moment, this is a surprise, because he was just feeling so satisfied and reassured that we have done everything right. And the guy started to tell him his story, which is the story now people tell about the left behind. And I think that it is best told by Erli Hochstein in her book Strangers in Their Own Land, about people who suddenly lost control over their lives and suddenly don't see a way out. And Michael Moore, to his credit, stopped, thinks, and actually immediately after that writes a paper about why Trump is going to win the election, one of the few people who said it before the election. So these people are now voicing a demand. And the interesting question is, why do they voice the demand in nationalistic terms? Because you can make claims or similar claims in different ways. And my claim is that the reason that they use nationalism is, first of all, because nationalism is there. It has always been there. It's a very useful tool, and people know how to use it. There's a long tradition of using nationalism. But more than that, the demand for nationalism, the nationalist demand is now being, in interesting ways, and I'm still thinking about it and I'm sort of learning more and more about it, and I think it is really evolving right now, is becoming a somehow complementary claim for social justice, which is not something that we would naturally think. But people say, you know, we want to renew the social contract of our society. We want to have some sort of mutual identity and solidarity, and David wrote really a lot about it. I've learned a lot from his work on the way nationalism promotes the welfare state and the ability to create the kind of willingness to share. So the demand for greater social justice and the demand for national solidarity now converge. And they converge in America, they now converge in a very interesting way in Denmark, in Finland, in Sweden, in places that you wouldn't think would need the national language in order to support the welfare state. And it becomes a demand to reinvigorate the social contract, to pay attention to those who were left behind, and to redistribute resources in order to make life more bearable for those people who are now feeling that they have been harmed in one way or another. So the nationalism of the vulnerable, I call them, are not, by the way, the vulnerable, don't misunderstand me, are not the least well off. The vulnerable are exactly the middle classes who are seeing their dreams collapsed. If it was the least well off, they would have no power to make, you know, a real social impact. Revolutions always happen when the middle classes are being harmed or feel that they are being harmed and would like to promote a change. So what we see is that this very massive group is waking up. Now, in order to define their demands, in order to claim something for themselves, they have to define themselves as a group. But something extremely interesting happens. They have no tools of self-definition because they are part of the majority. If you're a minority, then you know how you define yourself. If you're a territorial group, you know how you define yourself. But being a weak member of the majority is a strange position to be in, because nobody wants to define themselves as, okay, we're the people who didn't do it, or we're the people who are left behind, or we are the people who are less successful in our society. So their definition has much to do with the way they sort of separate themselves from the other. And it becomes relatively negative. It's we and not them. They are lacking the tools of positive self-definition, something that nationalism has done, in my view, very effectively in the old days, where we were all part of the national sort of project, including the elites. Nationalism knew how to create a positive self-identity. Now that the left behind are really left behind, especially in the intellectual and cultural sphere, they don't have a way to identify who they are in a positive way. They are withdrawn, unfortunately, very often to the more negative type of self-identification. Two. Okay. So I have 2 minutes and I'll say two things. So the first thing I would say, the first 1 minute is that I think that this is a reasonable response to what has been happening. And the second thing that I want to say is that turning or taking the national route is something people do, and if they choose it, it's not necessarily because they are narrow-minded or because they are irrational or because they are unable to understand the situation they live in. For some people, under some circumstances, including the circumstances of our times, the national choice is a rational choice. So just dismissing those people by saying you're irrational, you're populist, you don't understand your situation, you're uneducated, there's nothing that we can learn from you, is the wrong way to approach this issue, because at the end of the day, this dismissal, I think Matt writes about it quite a lot in his book, the dismissal creates more negativity, and the negativity creates a greater conflict. And what we should be looking for are ways of somehow recreating social solidarity and a cross-class coalition rather than intensifying this class clash or class war in order to re-establish the basis for working welfare democracies.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yuli, very much.
So the opening question was, what is the future of nationalism? And my answer to that would be the future for nationalism is good. And I'll explain why I think that's the case. A useful starting point, I think, is a slightly different question that I'm asked a lot, which is when you look at things like Brexit and Trump and what's happening in Europe, do those moments signal that we are nearing the end of a period of political churn and change, or do they instead symbolize the fact that we are entering into a new period of political disruption and fragmentation? And that's a fairly simplistic way of framing it, but it is a way that gets us into some of the broader debates about what's going on. In particular, the debates around generational change, which are very popular if you read the FT and The Economist, that all of this awkward stuff is going to go away as the angry old white men are replaced by the newly ascendant social liberals and ethnic minorities and this new cross-class coalition. If you would like a good example of that, I'd recommend Stan Greenberg's book, America Ascendant, who explained at length in 2015 how there was absolutely no chance that Donald Trump would ever win the White House because of the newly ascendant majorities in American society. It's a very seductive narrative, particularly for those on the liberal left, because it reduces politics to a conveyor belt, that you don't need to think about the grievances that are driving voters, because all you really need to do is boil politics down to a waiting game. Just wait for the awkward people to leave and the preferred groups to rise. It's one of many comfort blankets that fill our debate. Another is that all of this is a byproduct of the financial crisis. That's not convincing for various reasons, not least the basic life cycle of national populism, which was well on its way in the 1980s and 1990s, if not earlier. And another is that this is all about social media and Cambridge Analytica, which certainly raises important questions about electoral integrity, but I would argue those factors have been given a level of attention that is wholly disproportionate to their actual significance. The reason that national populism has a very good future, nationalism has a good future, I would argue, is that what we are seeing playing out is something different, which is really rooted in four deep-rooted, long-term structural shifts within our political systems and societies, which were a long time coming and still have a very long way to run. The first is simply the way in which our political systems are becoming much less representative of the key groups that are voting for national populists, namely working class voters and people without degrees. Even before you get to the issues around migration and ethnicity that I'll come on to, the simple reality of our political systems today is that they are gradually becoming further and further detached and distant from the groups that are most likely to vote for Trump, Brexit and other movements, all of which, by the way, have important differences, but they are generally united by a desire to prioritize the culture and the interests of the ethno-cultural majority and to give voice to a people who feel that they've been neglected or held in contempt by an elite. If, for example, you look at work on the UK and the US, it's very clear that our political systems are not representing those groups. Across the European Union today, 1 in 2 people feel that they have no voice in EU institutions, and they do actually have a point. If you look at work by Nicholas Carnes or Larry Bartels in the US, one of the reasons that that matters is because it's fueling an exclusion bias within our political systems, that they are pushing those groups out of the policy-making process, leaving them with very good reasons to wonder whether the legislation that's coming through the corridors of power is actually improving their lives. The second key factor, I would argue, certainly as a political scientist, are the rapidly declining levels of partisan identification that we have across Western democracies. That even if you don't think issues like migration and political responsiveness are important, the one thing you cannot deny is that across generations, fewer and fewer people now are loyal to what we would loosely call the established mainstream parties. Why does that matter? It matters because it's now much easier for populist parties to break through, irrespective of what issues are salient. If you're Five Star in Italy, if you're the Brexit Party in the UK, if you're the Greens in Germany, the future will be a lot more volatility and churn because we no longer have the anchors that once kept our party systems in a relatively stable position. That's just a backdrop. So even if we didn't have immigration, we didn't have rapid social and demographic change, I think we would still be here talking about populism because there would still be significant potential for parties that campaign against what I would loosely call the establishment. Okay, so the first two factors. But of course, we do have these social changes. We do have, in most Western states, unprecedented levels of migration, or certainly in the US, levels of migration that have not been seen since the early 20th century. And we need to therefore interrogate how that factor, those changes are really further enlarging space for nationalism and national populism. There are widespread fears across most Western societies about the perceived destruction of national identities, cultures, and traditions. I won't bore you with all of the survey evidence that we present in the book, but typically there are large majorities of people that say they would ideally like to reduce migration, if not slow the pace of change across their societies. In fact, if you look at the general history of migration within our democracies, whenever we've had quite a significant influx of migrants and migration, that has typically been followed by a negative public reaction that has manifested itself in political ways. Linked very closely to that, which is the third current, is the fourth, which is that is, I think, parallel or tied very closely to widespread feelings of relative deprivation, not worries over objective economic loss, which is where the left goes a little bit wrong, and I'll come back to that point, but rather fears over the social, cultural, and demographic decline of the dominant ethnic majority, a belief that the wider group is losing out to others in society and is being overlooked by culturally liberal media, political, and business elites. It is those latter concerns that explain why today national populism has the momentum, because in many societies they are the only parties that are arguing that it is legitimate for the government of a political community to give greater weight to the interests of its own members than to be seen to be prioritizing the interests of, and I quote, outsiders. Typically, that position was filled by conservative parties, but many voters today are now asking whether conservative parties are what their name implies. In both our public and political debate, we are ill-equipped to think seriously about how these issues are playing out because our political debate doesn't allow us to do so. What we really need to be thinking about, and in our discussion today, hopefully we'll get to this, is how those wider social and demographic changes are impacting on the identity of the majority group. Such worries are routinely dismissed as veering towards racism or a very narrow view of nationalism, as though nationalism is only ever an exclusionary ethnic conception of nationalism. The Liberal Democrat leader Vince Cable recently spoke for many, I suspect, when he claimed that people who voted to leave the European Union longed for a world where faces were white and much of the world's map was painted imperial pink. People are simply not ready to think about majority identity or to move beyond incredibly simplistic open versus closed or civic versus ethnic nationalism frameworks. And that is deeply problematic for several reasons. The first is that for the first time in much of Europe and North America, The majority group is now facing decline due to large rates of inward migration and or different rates of growth across different groups. This is going to have profound effects, and indeed is already having profound effects. If you look at the literature on who voted for Donald Trump and why, if you reminded white Americans that they are set to be a minority by 2040, 2045, something around that point, their support for Donald Trump increases significantly, as does their support for a more restrictive immigration policy. If you run the same experiment in the UK, and you remind white Britons that they are that they are already a minority in London and are set to become a minority more generally by year X, their support for more restrictive immigration policies also increases significantly. The reality of where we are headed politically and socially, therefore, is that parties that are reminding the dominant majority group of their declining status and position in society are going to attract growing support. The second reason that all of this is important is because it is going to increase the salience of ethnic identities within our societies. We need to think much harder about this and talk more openly about it, because as groups find themselves shrinking in size, they will become more firmly committed to their group identities. In the US, for example, Ashley Jardina has recently shown how the share of white Americans who now feel that white identity is important to them has more than doubled between the 1990s and the 2010s as immigration increased and debates over ethnic shifts moved to the forefront of political debates. So those more ethnically rooted identities, those group identities, are, I think, only going to become more salient as people gradually become aware of how their societies are changing. Another reason we need to think about it. The third is that we do know, as I've mentioned, that these fears over demographic decline are absolutely central to driving the political changes that we are discussing today. The psychologist Karen Stenner, who's written a very good book called The Authoritarian Dynamic, has shown that it is precisely when citizens feel what she calls normative threat, that they are no longer in control of social change, that they are no longer able to stop social change, and that they become aware of their diminishing status, that they become far more likely to mobilize and backlash politically. And national populism now is the preferred refuge for that backlash, also being a movement that has downplayed its more toxic ethnic nationalism and racism of the 1970s and 1980s, which I think is an important change on the supply side. And fourth, the reason as well that I think all of this is deeply problematic, and I think it's actually the most important reason, because I agree with Yuli that these long-term trends that we are going to see play out in our lifetimes and the generation to come, they are going to continue to cultivate significant potential for nationalist parties. So sort of my working assumption is the Le Pens and the Salvinis and the Trumps, these are not fleeting protests. These are now durable, permanent political movements. But what I think is especially important is that large parts of our political debate, especially on the liberal left, are simply unwilling to even enter into a more nuanced conversation and discussion about how we might navigate these broader social changes. The problem, one of the problems that we have today, is that we are only allowed to discuss identities that do not involve the majority group. We can talk about all other forms of identity, but we cannot talk about majority identity. Now, this is deeply problematic. If you are a pragmatist and you are interested in building consensus and in building the social solidarity that Yuli alluded to, then I'm afraid you are going to have that conversation. Liberals have routinely underestimated the potency and the reach of our national attachments. And I think they continue to misdiagnose the roots of support for these movements and why these identities are so important to people. The legacy of Marx and Marxist theories is still, I think, dominant, which is that all of this disruptive political change is ultimately rooted in competition over scarce economic resources. But people don't die for GDP. This is not about economic growth simply. That is at best, secondary factor in what's going on. That 30 years of research in the social sciences, which we summarize in the book, I think now has shown conclusively that of much greater importance to driving support for nationalism and populism today are fears over cultural, not economic loss. And there are multiple case studies that I could point to, from Switzerland to the affluent bastions in northern Italy, to the very wealthy pensioners who voted for Brexit, to the very wealthy middle-class Republicans who voted for Trump, that ultimately it is, in fact, I suspect, going to be this discussion around how we can respond to feelings of social and cultural loss that will determine whether or not we are able to fend off populist politics. I think David, one minute, David has said himself that one of the problems within the broader discussion is that we have ignored the social and political consequences of large-scale migration and demographic change for both the receiving and sending societies, which will, in the long run, end up being more significant, which I think is absolutely right. Eric Kaufman has recently shown in his book White Shift that fundamentally, when you boil down all of the different factors that are usually thrown into models trying to explain why people are leaving the mainstream and voting for national populism, it is ultimately about their concern over the demographic decline of their group that underpins much of that anxiety. That if you promote every other identity while not building a bridge between those identities, then don't be surprised when the white majority or white minority also organizes around their ethnic identity. Okay? And Yuli has argued in her book that if liberalism is to regain power, it needs to develop its own form of nationalism, one that reassures citizens that their leaders work for them and put their well-being first. And I would completely agree with that sentiment, and perhaps where I might disagree for the sake of discussion, and where perhaps we might move in a moment, is that I think most people now accept that we need to really think much more seriously about how we can create or encourage, cultivate, support a greater sense of belonging for all groups. I think that's ultimately where this conversation is. But I think where I would sort of diverge perhaps is that I want to ask a slightly different question that I'll leave hanging in the room that we can come back to in discussion, which is, does everybody want to participate in that conversation? Because it strikes me that there is a very loud group within our society that is not willing to compromise on those issues, is not willing to think about how we might build a new form of cross-group belonging, a new way of seeing the world that respects ethno-national traditions, symbols of nationhood, national identity, national culture. And that is the question that populism is throwing up, I think, for many, particularly on the liberal left, which is, what are you willing to concede? And if the answer to that is nothing, then the future is more polarization, and the future is more fragmentation, and the future is more Trumps and Salvinis and Le Pens. If instead the answer is, where we can take discussion, I'm willing to concede on some things but not others, let's think about how we might be able to build this new sense of belonging that is respectful of people's desire to slow the pace of social change and work more seriously at building integrated communities, then I think actually we have a very productive, interesting and positive discussion to have and place to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. So we'll segue to David.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for asking me. So my comments take the form mainly of some reflections on Yuli's book, though I also touch on themes that Matthew's just raised, and in fact come to the question he's just asked at the end of the discussion. And I also greatly admire the book that he's just presented the core of. I think it's a must-read on this topic. So Yuli's book is a bold defense of nationalism, and she's not afraid to bite bullets and grasp nettles along the way. I think what's important about it is the way in which she links the recent revival of nationalism to socioeconomic issues and the needs and interests of relatively deprived groups in our societies who, she argues, have good reasons to reaffirm their national identities and also good reasons to expect their political leaders to pay attention to their interests and to display what philosophers sometimes call compatriot partiality, in other words, weighing the interests of compatriots more heavily than the interests of outsiders. So, in her view, nationalism is not just some kind of irrational, backward-looking response in the way that it's often presented, I think, in popular discussion as a kind of lashing out without reason against current developments, but as something that we can understand as a rational response to social circumstances. And she also, I think importantly, buys into what I've sometimes called the national identity argument, which sees national identities as a source of social solidarity and therefore as a possible antidote to rising levels of inequality by virtue of the support that they provide for redistributive policies, the welfare state, income redistribution, and so on. I mean, that argument has proved frustratingly difficult to prove with hard evidence. I mean, I've been trying for a long time looking at various kinds of studies, psychological studies and so on, which try to link identity and redistribution, and the mechanisms are understood, but it's a bit harder to show that what drives redistribution in society-wide level is identity. And I think one reason for this, and this is the kind of theme that I want to develop, is that nations are, in aspiration, inclusive identities, but in practice nearly always also exclusive. And the reason for that is that the idea of a nation carries with it the idea of somebody who is a true national. So we have notions like true Brit or Ex-Deutsch, the real person, the real national, as opposed to somebody who just happens to be here. And I think that that image often contains two things. I mean, one, the idea is that the person, the true national, is somebody who has deep historical roots, who's born and bred. And the other idea is that it's somebody who adheres to the culture, the cultural values and practices of the majority. And this then, of course, creates problems in countries which have, as Matthew has emphasized, quite significant immigrant populations who are newcomers, but also are perceived as being culturally different from the majority, and therefore are not so easy to include in this sense of the national we. Now, of course, there has been historically a shift within national identities as they're held by large numbers of people in the direction of downplaying the ethnic sort of born and bred element in favor of more civic versions of national identity. And you can test this by asking people what factors they think of as being important to being a Briton or a French or Swedish. You can ask the question, and by tracking the answers, you can detect these shifts. But I think the important thing is that though the shifts have occurred, they have not gone all the way, and that most people will still attach some importance to the idea of being, as it were, rooted in a deep sense in the country in question. The other factor, I think, is that when immigrants arrive and are the bearers of new cultural values, this is often celebrated rightly as creating a more interesting, lively, vibrant cultural scene, new forms of cuisine, new art forms and so on. And liberals are very keen to celebrate these positive contributions of immigrant ethnic minorities. But this is not, I think, the whole story. And what also happens, I think, is that the cultural conflicts that arise have the effect of weakening the collective sense of identity across the whole society. I think it's particularly true in the case of societies which have a colonial past of some kind, where the arrival of immigrants creates demands that involve not just re-evaluating the past, which is something that always happens within national identities, but to disown it entirely, turn your back entirely on whole stretches of history. Now, how does Yuli deal with this issue? And it's quite clear that she rejects the idea of a purely civic nationalism, or what's sometimes been repackaged but as sort of patriotism, as Macron did in that speech that he gave at the time of the anniversary of the armistice, where he contrasted nationalism with patriotism. He seemed to be trying to portray a purely civic form of nationalism. And Yuli, I think, says, and I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from her book, nationalism can be tamed, but it cannot be constructed in ways that run counter to human nature and social psychology. The hope to have patriotism without flags, hymns, symbols, and a sense of identity by its very nature as inclusive contradicts everything we know about the way that groups are formed. So now, having said that, she then goes on to argue that the state must then take measures to ensure that minorities are respected, but she isn't explicit about what kind of measures those might be. And this discussion, I think, is compressed into a fairly short concluding chapter of the book. But it's crucial. It's a crucial question for liberal nationalists, which is what Yuli wants to be, who want to combine national identity with the equal treatment of citizens. Because as she argues throughout the book, the state must inevitably be involved in the process of reproducing and solidifying the national culture. So the question then is, how far can, when it does this, is it allowed to prioritize the inherited national culture? So since flags have been mentioned, just think about the flag issue. Think, for example, of the Israeli flag with its Star of David, which proclaims Israel's identity as a Jewish state. Or think, perhaps a bit less blatantly, about the Union Jack, which of course combines the crosses of three Christian saints and in a certain kind of way proclaims the Christian background to the kingdom. So the question could be put this way, I mean, should these symbols then be replaced by something culturally neutral, like the Canadian maple leaf or something of that sort? So, if you're not going to go that way, if you're going to keep the Union Jack and the Star of David, how are these minority groups going to be respected and drawn in to the national conversation in the way, for example, that Matthew was suggesting at the end of his talk?
Great, thank you, David. So just, I'd like to keep things moving if we may. So what I'd like to do in a slight break with convention, can I invite you just to turn to your neighbour and talk for 2 minutes about what the question is that you'd like to ask? And then we're going to come back and get your questions, please. So just, if you just turn to your neighbour initially. Great. So what I propose to do is we'll take 3 questions in sequence. Obviously, I know you all want to have your say, but do please be clipped and precise with your questions, and then I'll invite the panelists to respond to that. So if you'd like to ask a question, do please raise your hand. Great. So in the front in the grey coat, and just keep your hands up so I can catch your eye, and then we'll go to the back with these 2. Yeah.
I would just say to Professor Goodwin, I sympathize when you say some people don't want to have the conversation. I'm thinking of Mr. Juncker's incomprehensibly stupid comment last week about people who love their own country being stupid, being terrifically counterproductive. So I would like to ask about an alternative to a wider conversation about majority identity, because some people will say, well, in countries with specific electoral practices, like in the Austrian presidential election or the French presidential election, where all the liberals could get together, essentially, where the left and right, as we traditionally think of them in economic competition, are not competing against each other and full-on take on the idea of a nationalist narrative, that the populists are winning in places where they are facing a divided opposition. Is that... I don't think so, but I'm curious to see, because I know there will be people that say it's just about unifying liberal force. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Come from the back in grey.
I just wanted to ask, did Obama give birth to Trump? In the sense that Obama could be seen as maybe the future in terms of a world where there's a sort of a mixture and this and that. And the people who voted for Trump didn't like that, and so they voted for him.
And Cecile.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a bit puzzled that the panel only considered the demand for nationalism on the part of ordinary people, but not the supply of nationalism today, which mostly comes from parties and ideologies that are clearly right-wing and has no connection, or very little connection, to the aspirations of ordinary people. Just give 2 examples. Right-wing parties play on the fear of migration and diversity, but it's just not the case that people who live in diverse and multicultural areas are more likely to fear diversity and vote for nationalist party. The reverse is true. Likewise, social justice. I agree with Yuli that there are lots of left behinds that have credible aspirations, credible feelings about being left behind, and they want social justice. It's just not the case that either Trump or Brexit have a social justice agenda. So there's a complete disconnect between the legitimate aspiration of for nationalism on the part of ordinary people and what actual nationalist parties are offering.
Great, thank you. Yuli, what would you like to answer?
Okay, thanks. Great questions, and thank you for the comments. I'll start with Cecile's question. You're right. I think I wrote this book because of the lack of supply. It is actually a way of approaching my progressive left-wing friends, saying, you know, and Matthew said it, and I think David said it, unless we recruit our, you know, unless we recruit nationalism on our side in order to make greater social justice, greater social connectability, a rebirth of the cross-class coalition, we're losing out, because people are looking for the national sort of agenda, but we're not offering it. So that's, I think, it also goes back. And that's a huge mistake. It has been a mistake in Israel. It has been a mistake around the world. And it is becoming more crucial. I think we are seeing the beginning. I think the election today in Denmark and what happened in Sweden a few weeks ago, that left-wing parties are saying, yes, we are offering more welfare, but more strict immigration policies, is the beginning of an understanding of a new discourse which will recreate some nuances that we don't have right now. I just want to take David's point a little bit further about what are the solutions, because, okay, we're looking for solutions. Social justice is one of them. But a greater sensitivity to identity, as you rightly mentioned, David, is the most important thing. For me as a liberal nationalist, it's not that I have to make the public sphere neutral. I don't believe in neutrality. I've never seen a neutral public sphere. Maybe this one, actually. But usually they aren't. But it is, first of all, acknowledging the fact that the way the public sphere is structured creates for the minority a sense of discomfort, maybe inferiority. So in my old days at Oxford, where every room had this huge cross, and I would say to people, I'm a secular person, I don't mind crosses, but beware of the fact that for me it's strange, different. I don't know, that I have to bow at the end when I got my, PhD to somebody who's wearing this huge cross. For me as a Jew, it was different, I would say. So I just want that to be acknowledged, because acknowledging that makes you think about the solution of making it more bearable for me. So it's not about abolishing symbols. If we took religious symbols from all the flags of the world, very few would be left behind. But I want people to acknowledge that this is a discomfort. And yes, I do think the flag of Israel is creating a problem for Israeli Arabs. Let's find ways of incorporating them. It's not a zero-sum game. If your flag is this, then you're absolutely excluded. Let's find a way of including them. Let's have like the United States two hymns, one that is more nationalistic and one that is more inclusive. Let's open the public sphere. Let's write the name of Israel when it is on the national emblem in Hebrew and Arabic. So yes, it's Israel. It's historically, religiously Jewish, but no, it acknowledged the fact that other people live here and they have a place in the society. And the compromises are not great. It's in the spirit of Isaiah Berlin, I always says, what I'm looking for is untidy compromises, but they are real, and they are the only real thing that could solve the problem and make us more sensitive of the way people feel about their identity. So the big liberal mistake was ignoring identity. Once you are there, there's not, one solution fits all, but there are many solutions, and we should be working to surface the kind of solutions that we want to offer in order to make liberal nationalism more viable.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Well, what great questions. The two of the questions really touched on this issue of the realignment of politics, and I've just finished reading the Cultural Backlash book, which essentially presents national populism as a byproduct of value change in our societies, as the sort of the middle class baby boomers and their kids effectively who benefited from the post-war boom, sheltered from economic wins, then became more post-material, more focused on lifestyle issues, and that left behind an alliance of traditional conservatives and blue-collar workers who basically joined forces to push back through the populist wave that began in the 1980s. And actually, interestingly, the first person who made that argument was Piero Ignazi in 1992 in a very good article in the European Journal of Political Research. But I think what we're witnessing today, he called it the silent counter-revolution to the liberal revolutions of the 1960s. What we're now probably going to witness is the counter-revolution to the counter-revolution, in the sense of liberals and Greens and middle-class professionals aligning themselves against what they see as this sort of ultra-conservative nationalist turn. But I think it's going to be a bit more complex than that. And I'm slightly won over by Piketty's article recently arguing that, in effect, and again, why I think national populism and nationalism probably has a pretty good future, he argues that, in effect, the two mainstream blocks in our politics, the centre-left and the centre-right, have been either hijacked or will continue to exhibit a real weakness in the new kind of global, kind of left-behind elephant curve era that we're going into, which is the right has always been dominated by what Piketty calls the merchant elite, a high-income, affluent elite that has very little interest in serious structural economic reform. Think David Cameron, Boris Johnson. But crucially, the centre-left now has been hijacked by what Piketty would call the Brahmin left, which is more fixated with identity politics than it is with economic redistribution. Think David Lammy, for example. Now, that leaves a massive gap for parties or movements that are pitching to low-income, low-educated, but instinctively socially conservative voters who do want to reform the economic settlement, but also want a greater sense of cultural protectionism. And I think it's that formula that is increasingly going to govern one side of our politics. Can I have a little bit more economic security, but can I also have a little bit more cultural security? And why will national populism do well amid that formula? I'll tell you, because I think it's easier for the right to move left on economics than it is for the left to move right on culture. Okay, it's easier for the right to move left on economics, to sprinkle manifestos with a bit of redistribution and interventionism, than it is for the left to even open the box that's sitting before us in this discussion today, which is about faith, flag, and family. And the left historically is terrible at talking about anything that comes close to culture and belonging. And just lastly, before I hand over to David, I would take issue with the presentation of the relationship between demography and support for populism. It's actually quite different. We now have, I would say, half a dozen studies that show support for Trump, support for Brexit, support for populism in Europe, and we summarize them in the book, is significantly higher in areas that experience a very rapid but significant amount of demographic change. And I can point you to various studies if you'd wish. We've done a meta-analysis with Eric Kaufman and I called the diversity wave, where we find that people feel most threatened by demographic change at the very small ward level. That then sort of drifts away at the town sort of local authority level, but then comes back at the national level. Why does that matter? Because if a local community experiences a sudden, quick burst of change, people feel very under threat. That's Karen Stenner's idea of normative threat. They're not so fussed at the town level, but symbolically, when they look at the nation, then that feeling of threat kicks in again, because everything that they cherish around nationhood and identity and ways of life is seen to be eroding and slipping away. So I think the relationship is a little bit more complex than the question alluded to.
And can I just pick up on, while we're on the subject of electoral outcomes, the excellent question about whether Obama led to Trump. Was the implication a kind of race-based reaction to Obama? Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's both. It's race,
Yeah.
but also call him the elite sort of.
Yeah.
Professor from some sort of highfalutin.
Yeah.
State
Constitutional law professor.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got a couple in the room. Yeah.
Somebody who just shoots from the hip or something like
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean,
sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just anxious about time. I think the question's spot on. I just read Hillary Clinton's book, What Happened. I got to the end and I realized she still doesn't know what happened. in the sense that it was all about the campaign. It was, why didn't I go to Michigan? Why didn't I go to Pennsylvania? Actually, I'd recommend the work of John Sides, a political scientist in the US, and John has shown convincingly that the foundations for Trump were set in before he even descended the elevator in Trump Tower, before he even announced his candidacy, in that typically less well-educated white Americans with only some high school education, or perhaps had done 1 or 2 years at college and then gone in another direction, they had started to abandon the Democrats in real significant numbers from 07, 08, mainly during the Obama presidency. And I think that's absolutely a critical foundational point to explaining how Trump then stepped into that space. But of course, what were they worried about? About 1 in 3 of those voters that abandoned the Democrats were worried about migration and how it was affecting the nation. A lot of the people in counties that went Obama, Trump, some nice studies showing that they too were very anxious about the pace of social change in America. But I am won over by the argument that what we are seeing playing out actually is not. There is a very strong economic element to this, and I'm very wary of the way in which we're setting up this rather misleading, simplistic debate about, is it all economics or is it culture? It's clearly about how they interact, at what level do they interact, and political scientists need to think much more seriously about economics, but economists need to think much more seriously, I think, about culture and identity and how those play out on political behavior. But it's quite clear that fears over the demographic and cultural decline of the majority group made a significant number of Americans far more receptive to Trump's message.
Do you want to comment on these, or should we get more questions?
I mean, I just want to say one very brief thing, which is that in response to Cecile Labord's question. I mean, that in what you might think of as the sort of golden age of social democracy, social democratic parties were clearly, in a mild sense, patriotic nationalist as well as social democratic. And you can see this in all the imagery, the People's Home in Sweden and so on, the post-war Labour government. And so in a sense that dimension was never, it was kind of neutralised in a way. And what I think has happened is that that space has now been evacuated, and therefore the voter is left with a rather unpalatable choice, it seems to me, between, as you rightly say, a kind of nationalism that is really displays no particular concern for the interests of worse-off people, and on the other hand, the remnants of a social democratic movement that's become too caught up with questions of identity and so on. So that's really the dilemma.
Great. Let's get some more questions, if we may. So just at the front here, and then also with the hand, and then over there, please. And
Thanks. Would you say that the foundations for what Farage is doing now were the similar ones that the foundations of Trumpism, that they've been going on for some time, and he's just picked it out in a very timely way?
thank you. The lady at the front.
Yes, my concern is, or my question rather, is that a lot of these movements are being funded by some very wealthy individuals. I'm just wondering what would motivate them to actually sort of fund these very right-wing movements.
Okay, great. And in the blue jacket.
Thank you very much for your talk. I just want something, put it question directly with my experience. After a minute or listening on radio before the referendum, I knew it's a finish. Why I knew? Because I had experience with this. And I'm asking you a question, if you, is anybody of you look at what's happening in Balkan, in the ex-Yugoslavia? The question which I'm trying to raise, we're not aware, we're playing with nationalism like a, do you want this ice cream or do you want another chocolate or strawberry ice cream? And I'm asking you, are you aware how dangerous all these nationalists in Yugoslavia came to the democratic process of the voting people? And people didn't believe it is going to be anything serious. And I'm asking you, when you're writing, when you're putting this, are you thinking something more than just for tomorrow? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So, Yuli, do you want to take the last great question?
I'll start with the last one, which is, yeah, obviously, yes. I think one of the things that people usually say, and I think it captures also some of the spirit of what you asked, is that the reason nationalism is now emerging is because people are forgetting the bad old days of, you know, fascism and Nazism and so on. And sort of nationalism sort of has now a different flavor, and it's sort of somehow disconnected from its more belligerent, horrific parts. And I think when I said that what I'm doing is a call for action, that I think we should do both. We should try and harness nationalism for more liberal, progressive purposes, but not forget for a moment that it can go wrong. It's a dangerous game, I agree. However, we are, or maybe we weren't aware that playing the liberal game or the democratic game could get dangerous too. And in that respect, again, I'm a student of Azar Berlin. I think every idea could be taken to its, you know, really extreme conclusions, and it will become very, very dangerous. So we are playing with dangerous. Everything that is powerful is also dangerous, and we have to be aware of that every day that we speak about nationalism. I don't think it's about funding. I think, you know, people fund democratic movement, liberal movement, progressive movements. It's about recruiting people. And the one thing we can't forget is nationalism is a great way of recruiting people for action. And again, then the question comes, is it a good action? Is it a bad action? You know, I always say the slogan, "Make America Great Again," is not a bad slogan. The question is, how do you define great? And that's the biggest moral issue that, you know, is going to be with us for the rest of our life as political agents.
So, you know, can I just come back on that? So David read a passage earlier, which I picked up on as I was reading your book as well, which was there's a potentially a sense of, as it were, psychological determinism, or if not determinism, that's maybe too strong a word, but that the, as it were, the natural timber of humanity pushes us towards communities which have very thickly defined cultures, where the basic expectation is that people comply and uphold and participate in those cultures. And in a way, maybe what we've experienced in the West in the last 30 years or so, prior to 2015, was this slightly unusual cultural space where after the Cold War, there was we had the proceeds of victory in the Cold War, a sense that we didn't need to define ourselves ideologically in opposition to anything. And actually what we're seeing now is a recontestation, actually on both sides politically, for ownership of that cultural space. And really what that is just the outworking of a deep psychological instinct that we desire to live in communities that have thick cultures, and we disagree about what the thick cultures are that we want that to be. So is that a picture that you'd endorse, and that therefore, as it were, we're committed to some kind of thick group identity, and nationalism isn't a bad one as it goes? It's a kind of, as it were, a Churchillian definition of nationalism. You know, it's as Churchill said of democracy, it's a terrible form of government apart from all the others. And it's a terrible form of group identity apart from all the others. Could you just react to that? Is it just linked psychologically?
Yeah, I think it is actually very essential to my argument. I bring in the book this short exchange between Einstein and Freud, where Einstein wrote to Freud after the war a set of letters called "Why War Persists," and he's trying to ask Freud to explain, why do people go to war? I mean, after the terrible experience of the First World War, they went to the terrible experience of the Second World War, and he says, so why don't we sort of live together in harmony, like a Kantian sort of eternal peace? And Freud says, well, it would be best if we all live, we could all live according to liberal sort of rules and abstract instructions, but that is beyond our psychological means. And I think what Freud meant, and I think what I mean sorry for putting me and Freud in the same sort of sentence, but what I mean is that we need identity. I'm very much in this respect a student of Charles Taylor about, you know, thick identities and the meaning they provide us when we make choices, when we try to construct our life. Thick identity, by the way, are not only national one. They could be other identities. It is important to say that not only it's an overlap of identity and economics, it is an overlap of different kind of identities, and we all play our identities at different times in different ways. I'm sometimes a feminist, I'm sometimes an Israeli, I'm sometimes a political theorist. Depends where I sit and what I do. But we need these identities. They are essential for us. And giving giving space for identity to develop. And that's why part of the book deals with the way nationalism created this positive identity. We in the university don't like to remember that most of university studies were in the service of something bigger than the university. It was religion first, and then the nation, history, culture, archaeology, geography. Every story we told was somehow related to this narrative. And producing an important and meaningful narrative is something that we should be seeking together. And this is where we want to be involved, because we don't want to be involved in a story of, as Michael Ignatieff writes about the Balkan, of blood and belonging, but we want to be involved in a story of creativity, of somehow being together in a community that is of value to all of us. And you're right, we will disagree what it is, and that disagreement is the essence of democracy.
Great, thank you. Matt, Trump and Farage.
So on the UK, the question about, I assume, the Brexit Party and the foundations for that, I mean, in my mind at least, that all represents our failure to respond to the reasons why Britain voted to leave the European Union. That if you are very sad like me and you spent a couple of evenings ago going through the European election results by local authority, one of the striking things that struck me was the extent to which, firstly, Labour collapsed across Wales and traditional northern areas, but also the quite striking levels of support in those areas going to a party that is really offering nothing in the way of economic redistribution or reform, but is offering quite a strong message on the cultural axis and the anti-establishment populist axis. And so I think there's going to come a curious tension point, perhaps not long from now, where a lot of voters that might be thinking that they're voting for a party that is going to radically reform the existing social and economic settlement are going to realize that that is in effect not going to happen. And that's going to leave us in a place that will probably feel a lot more fragile than the place that we're in now, and which is, you know, the kind of Peter Mayer hypothesis that, in effect, it's, you know, given the broader evolution of Western democracies, at some point it's likely that citizens will turn away from politicians and politicians will turn away from citizens. And perhaps one of the new movements that will arise in British politics for those reasons will be apathy, and apathy may end up being the big winner from Brexit. A lot of voters feeling as though they, for different reasons, expressed a desire to change the settlement. That was not met. Let's wait and see. And having concluded that voice makes little difference, then, you know, exit is one of the only options left, and that exit is an exit from the political process. I don't think that's a particularly great place for Britain to be, but I sort of feel that almost that's an inevitable place for us to go now, because we're not looking at a political movement that is offering kind of classical, you know, sort of redistributive policies. It doesn't even have a manifesto. It's not even saying anything. I mean, apart from yesterday, it wanted to sort of basically nationalize steel, which, you know, is perhaps a message more in line with David's point about perhaps where Labour used to be. Let's wait and see. I think it's early days.
Okay, great. Let's take just 3 more questions quickly, and we'll be really precise if we could. So in the check shirt, and there was the black thing. I'll just see. Yeah.
Great. David touched on the decline of social democracy briefly earlier. My question is, there's been a spectacular collapse in social democracy throughout many European countries, particularly Italy, France, Germany, and several other countries. We could include New Labour here, I think, as well. Have you any comments on, it hardly seems to have been commented on in the press. Have you any comments on why social democracy has collapsed in such a spectacular way? And is it partly, at least, due to the rise of nationalist parties, like Marine Le Pen and the Italian parties, and Nigel Farage and so on? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just behind you as well.
Yes, I was thinking that if we'd had this session 10 years ago, we would have automatically assumed that nationalism meant things like Scottish nationalism, Basque nationalism, etc. And I suppose I observed that if you say the words Scottish nationalism, Irish nationalist, German nationalist, Hungarian nationalist, and English nationalists, they each connote something really rather different to our minds. And I suppose my question is, are we talking about a single syndrome here, or should the kind of analysis Matthew has given would it be different when applied to those different manifestations of what we all call nationalism?
Great, thank you. And just, I'm going to abuse chair's privilege and ask the third and final question, and then we'll come to the panel. So, just a reflection on the discussion we've had is that I think there's a tension between the place of race or ethnicity in relation to nationality. So on the one hand, nationalism seems to offer a non-race-based politics. And that looks like it might be one of its strengths. And contrary-wise, it looks like the definition of nationalism, which endorses a thick majority identity, may have race as one of the components, ethnicity as one of the components of that. And I feel like that's a tension that we've not properly explored or reconciled. So I'd love to just get comments from the panel on that. So can we just go, Matt, maybe on the collapse of social democracy, Yuli on the strands of nationalism, and then anyone else who wants to come on race. Yeah.
On the collapse of social democracy. So,
So the decline of social democracy, I think, was inevitable. There was a great book in 1985, Capitalism and Social Democracy, which predicted effectively what's happening today, which is that as the sort of university-educated professional middle class expanded, that these parties would find themselves with two groups that held irreconcilable differences on other issues that have since risen up the ladder of priorities, that middle class liberals and professionals, and I'm being slightly crude with these terms, but you get what I mean, hold a fundamentally different value set on issues like migration or EU membership than traditional social democrat voters in sort of blue collar backgrounds, typically less well educated and instinctively more socially conservative. Now, in an earlier era of the 1990s and 2000s, I mean, Blair's great gamble was that he could pitch to the middle class and the working class had nowhere else to go. And he cashed out successfully with 3 election victories. But that was also an era when the dominant issues really were the economy and public services. So it's a lot easier to build cross-class solidarity around those issues because everybody agrees that we need a good economy, and everybody, at least in the UK, as Trump's now discovering, agrees that we need a good NHS and we need to spend money on that. Today, that's much more complex because the issue agenda has been turned on its head, that the top issues now are far more around culture and identity, EU membership, migration, Islamist terrorism, issues like that, which I think have really put a wedge within that coalition. I don't think over the long term, I mean, this is a sort of famous prediction that will go terribly wrong. I think social democracy will have to be fundamentally recast. I think we'll end up seeing what Germany's going through at the moment, which is a much more radical assault on social democracy from the Greens and the more sort of radical elements of the left. And we'll see, what was perhaps a more sort of economically, socially liberal version of social democracy with Third Way and so on. That will be resigned to the dustbin of history, and Change UK is another example of how that won't necessarily return anytime soon. But I think inevitably social democrats will be pushed into this sort of counter revolution, and that will accelerate, I think, their losses among traditional working class voters who will now actually have somewhere to go. There's a reason that political scientists describe national populist parties as the new working class parties. They're not predominantly working class, and we need to remind ourselves that these aren't overwhelmingly working class electorates, but they are strongly working class electorates. I mean, there are cases that we've had even in the UK where for a while UKIP in relative terms was more successful among the working class than Labour. And if you look and you drill down at who's voting for the Brexit Party today, it's C2 skilled workers. It's the plumbers, the electricians, it's the factory workers, it's the group that's squeezed between the middle class liberal professionals above and the unemployed and those on welfare below. It's the group that aspires to work hard and play by the rules but feels that the current settlement is not respecting them and not recognising their voice. So social democracy, to me, has a pretty gloomy future, not necessarily a gloomy future for the principles that it seeks to advance, but as a political project, I'm not entirely sure that it will be able to survive over the longer term in its current form.
I mean, I agree with this. I just want to add that you know, economic and technical change, changes in the structure of work, the decline of trade unions, I think this is also part of the picture, because certainly in this country, and I think in other, for example, Scandinavian countries, the close link between social democratic parties and trade unions gave them a kind of solidity and resilience and capacity to deliver votes, which was very important. And you could see here the way in which often the union vote, which was rather conservative on certain issues, would sort of counterbalance some of the enthusiasms like the CND, for example, the old battles over nuclear disarmament, where the unions were the kind of moderating and conservative influence. So I think the decline of that kind of traditional working class politics has also been a factor that's made it harder for social democratic parties.
Yeah, just the last word about nationalism. Like liberalism, like democracy, like any other political concept, nationalism has many forms. In the book, I also talk about secessionalist nationalism, and even then, it's not made of one cast. The different types of nationalism. Nationalism is defined in different places in different terminology, but there is a common, I think, phenomena, and the common phenomena goes back to Tom's question. It's this acknowledgement of the importance of belonging and the motivating power of belonging to a group, both for political reasons and for distributive reasons. That, I think, is something that all national movements sort of share. And they share also something that I think is very important. It's the desire to be active and to be a participant, if not self-ruling, at least a participant in public life. Therefore, this kind of nationalism we're talking about is a modern phenomenon. It's very much part of the way we define ourselves as political agent in the modern world. But then it has many, many different forms, and because it is so much culture-related and narrative-related and linguistically grounded, it will be very different in different parts of the world.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We've had a very rich discussion this evening. I'm sure discussions will continue onwards. I warmly commend the books to you. They're both excellent flyers, as mentioned, and outside. But before we go, can I invite you to thank our panelists, our speakers?